Thank you very much indeed. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you today and to launch what I'm sure is going to be an absorbing, thought-provoking conference. The Centre for Humanitarian Leadership is truly a joint collaboration between Deakin and Save the Children Australia, who are proud co-producers, co-organisers of this wonderful event. Many, if not all, of the issues being discussed over the next 2 days are complex and vexed. There are no simple answers. There are few, if any, moral certitudes. The perspectives you will hear and the conversations you'll participate in are not possible without formats like this that allow time for much deeper examination and the free contest of ideas. During the conference, you're going to challenge the traditional place and value attached to humanitarian systems, actors, and perceptions. You're going to focus on who are the real humanitarians and thus challenge existing practices and historical understandings. As overdue as this is, it's certainly not going to be easy. It will not be easy to balance what we must learn from the past, despite its shortcomings, with what we must forge anew. And in this context, I'm going to reflect on Deakin University and the legacy of Alfred Deakin to illustrate both our own thinking and also suggest how we might consider a wider approach. We certainly must not shy away from these conversations just because they're demanding or uncomfortable. On the contrary, we must engage with people who have knowledge, we must listen to others' lived experiences, and we must better try to understand and learn from the past. I look forward to having these conversations with you. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. So famously wrote the British novelist L.P. Hartley in the opening line of his 1953 novel, The Go-Between. In that first chapter, his narrator, Leo Colston, is in the attic of his childhood home, looking at trinkets from his youth. These long-lost items are bringing up uncomfortable memories he had suppressed. One in particular evokes unwelcome feelings, a diary he'd written about his experiences as a child. He says of the diary, "I did not want to touch it and told myself that this was because it challenged my memory. I was proud of my memory and disliked having it prompted." The past can be confronting, or indeed, through the rose-tinted lens of nostalgia, it can be comforting, even a motivating force for recreating a lost world. We've all seen to that effect too, make something great again. Over the last few decades, we've had to confront some untold truths about our past, especially things that took place under the cover of the once immutable institutions that governed our society. More recently, there's been another series of flashpoints, including the Black Lives Matter protests and the Me Too movement. In Australia, more specifically, royal commissions have uncovered the truth across a range of serious social issues and failings. And indeed, even within the humanitarian sector, sexual abuse and harassment by aid workers of vulnerable community members has been a point of controversy and focus. There is no doubt our collective past is coming under greater and greater scrutiny. These moments prompt us to pause and re-examine the people and the institutions we've relied on and perhaps taken for granted. We also start to question those who we venerate through our organisations, our statues and monuments, the awarding of honours, right down to the language we use and the inherent bias it betrays. We're having to look at the framework behind the walls and the foundations beneath the floor. This is an uncomfortable process, often even painful. To many, it feels like an upheaval, a tearing down of the structures that support our society, however flawed they might be. But to many others, it feels long overdue, a process of truth-telling and of setting things right. As we learn new perspectives of our history, a strong temptation is to judge the past solely on our present values. One of the greatest challenges is being sympathetic to the context of the time, to understand, just like today, issues were complex and contextual. In particular, it's very difficult to neatly separate the social and political structures of the past from the people who lived among them, the challenges they faced, the privileges they enjoyed, the views they held, and the reasoning that underpinned them. Let me reflect on Australia's two very different origin stories as an entry point to the discussions that will take place during this conference. These two stories converged in the late 18th century, and even now, 233 years later, our country is still trying to reconcile what came of this, the aftermath of two cultures colliding. The healing process of reconciliation continues today, and in some years we make better progress than in others. There is no simple solution. Compassion takes time to take effect. But reconciliation is not about throwing away one part of our history. Both origin stories have their place. It should, and indeed must, be about acknowledging, reflecting, and moving forward together. A genuine reconciliation, from the Latin conciliare, to bring together. The Yolngu word, makarata, also describes the process of conflict resolution, peacemaking, and justice, and is used in the profound and extremely moving Uluru Statement from the Heart. It reads, "Makarata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle." What a truly poetic meaning that expresses the initial pain, shared empathy, and forgiveness that needs to follow. At Deakin, we've recently reaffirmed our commitment to the Indigenous people of this country. In our new 10-year strategic plan, Deakin 2030 Ideas to Impact, we have committed to reconciliation and treaty, to advance the educational aspirations of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and to help move Indigenous knowledges into the mainstream of Australian life. All our endeavours aim to reflect on Australia's full history and seek to build an inclusive future. However, just like many other institutions, just as in the humanitarian sector, we must also acknowledge our past if we're to grow and move forward together. Universities form a significant part of the social structure of our past and present. As places of knowledge and learning, they've played and continue to play an influential role in defining the prominent thinking of the day. Given this, what is the role of universities in humanitarian leadership now? And in order to be seen as leaders, how do we address the challenges of our own histories, their inconsistencies, and indeed perhaps hypocrisies? As a modern, globally connected university, we at Deakin see our fundamental role as delivering outcomes that benefit society locally, nationally, and globally. Our efforts across the university aim to achieve this or to support this endeavour. We will work with others, collaborate, seek strong partnerships, and seek those that will endure. But historically, universities have not always been community-facing and open to society at large. In fact, they came under regular criticism for being cloistered, shut off from the world. The first universities created in Europe by Christian monks, with the University of Bologna founded in 1088. Since that time, reflecting wider shifts in political, economic, and intellectual realities, universities across the globe have become more secular. And indeed, Australia's university is absolutely in this mould. In Australia, in 1850, the University of Sydney was established, adopting the principle of institutional autonomy, offering entry without religious qualification. That would become the model for almost all Australian higher education, an autonomous, professional, comprehensive, secular, public, and indeed community university. But as each new Australian university was established, their links to the predominant Commonwealth history and culture remained strong. We can still see this clearly in the names of many formed in the second half of the 20th century. Monash University, 1958, La Trobe, 1964, Curtin and Flinders, 1966, James Cook, 1970, and yes, Deakin University, formed in 1974 and named after Alfred Deakin, Australia's second Prime Minister and one of the primary architects of federation. From these foundations, from these Anglo-centric cultural origins, how can we create a better and stronger blend of worldviews and cultural knowledge? And indeed, what is in a name? Does a name and its connotations and its history define an institution? At the request of senior Indigenous leaders and members of the Deakin families, we've begun the conversation about the origin and symbolism of our university's name. As the saying goes, organisations evolve in the direction of the questions they ask. We're extremely grateful to be able to ask these important questions and discuss them respectfully. I'm aware that so many of you are joining me from around the world, but I think a little bit of a background to Alfred Deakin is important. Alfred Deakin was a complex character, a man of many parts. He was absolutely a product of his time, but he also projected himself into the future. He was a teetotaler, didn't smoke, and in his youth was a strict vegetarian. He was drawn to spiritualism and mysticism, but also based much of his worldview on Christianity. He was politically astute, especially in the art of compromise, but also plagued by self-doubt throughout his career, despite overt and open confidence and his impressive skills in oratory. Like his persona, his record of political achievements is multifaceted. Some elements almost contradictory, or at least not stereotypical for a conservative politician of that era. Through advocacy and the introduction of legislation, he championed workers' rights and conditions in factories and pioneered better irrigation practices to improve agriculture and stimulate economic growth. While a product of the British colonies and loyal to the empire, he was an Australian foremost, and his passion was the movement for federation. However, and without doubt, there are other activities and views he espoused in the political arena that, without doubt in today's context, are problematic and troubling. In particular, his views on nationalism, white Australia, and race relations more broadly. However, we have to be careful to avoid seeing these aspects in isolation and to judge accordingly. As Alfred Deakin himself said, "We are what others have made us. Individuality is a cautious compound of other lives." And as John Lanoisi observed in his biography of Deakin, of all men yet concerned in Australian politics, he is the last who should rest neatly labelled in a historical pigeonhole. Alongside this, and importantly, we must acknowledge that there is an Alfred Deakin legacy and a Deakin University legacy. The two, well linked, have their own identities, their own achievements, and the university continues to forge its own reputation. We believe, and a view shared by many of our local Indigenous leaders, is the best legacy for Alfred Deakin is Deakin University bringing Indigenous and colonial history together to forge something uniquely and distinctly Australian. Bringing together expertise in a distinctive cultural setting and finding ways to unite people from different cultures and experiences. The fusion of many cultures and ideas is stronger than any one on its own. The 8 portables on the edge of a campus in 1986 became the Institute of Koori Education and today Ngākiri, and the more than 1,000 Indigenous students from communities across the nation who graduated since are a key and pivotal part of the legacy of Deakin University. There is no one right approach or response to reconciliation. It is a coming together of cultures over time. Acknowledgement of the past comes first, then we work to create a harmony of voices and ethos and a shared vision for the future. Yeah, language is absolutely powerful, and we choose to name things for the symbolism and evocation it evokes. But as we find out more about our past, we must acknowledge both the good and the bad. But rather than discard all of one culture's language and memory, we must work even harder to achieve a better blend of Indigenous and other names and symbols. While our universities are steeped in European history, what we haven't got, we don't have, is the equivalent from Indigenous history, a real gap. We took the British model, and not known or acknowledged at the time was there's more than 60,000 years of rich culture that surrounded us. To quote Professor Grace Karskens from the University of New South Wales, describing Sydney, but applicable to so many of the landscapes in this wonderful land, these are story lands, replete with meanings so dense, so rich, so poignant, so ancient, so modern, and yet so often invisible. It is our duty to continue to uncover these stories, to learn from them and reconcile, the essence of Makarrata. In our own strategic plan, through our own commitments, we've acknowledged this as a central theme. It's part of our university, Deakin's commitment to a shared future. The road extending behind us and ahead of us is absolutely not clear of obstacles and debris, nor is it free of traps and snares, many of which of our own making. We must take the best of the past with us and acknowledge and learn from the worst. And what about the rest of that foreign country of the past that we are yet to discover and to judge? We know that for many Indigenous people, the present, not the past, is a foreign country, so we certainly have a long way to go. Stan Grant, a Wiradjuri man and one of our country's greatest minds, said, Whenever our history looms over the present, obscuring progress, the past frames the present and denies the future. We must not let our past cast such a shadow over our future, but we must have these important conversations. We have to continue to learn and travel forward together. To borrow the thoughts of another British author, although in this case, one like me who went out to the so-called colonies and became an Australian, Alex Miller, the story of our journey is always a fiction. It's always dealing with the past on the present's terms. We tell the story in order to free ourselves from the past so that we can move on, not in order to recover the past, which is merely nostalgia. Travelling, moving on, seeking the future is what we do. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of today's conference.